Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for the 2020 NACOLE webinar series. Today we'll be discussing the handling of demonstrations and protests by civilian oversight agencies. We are grateful to have members of both the Seattle Office of Police Accountability and the District of Columbia's Office of Police Complaints with us today to not only discuss the process that is in place in their agencies, but also the challenges they have faced as a result of the demonstrations that have taken place in response to the death of George Floyd. Before I introduce today's speakers, I want to remind all of you that you have entered today's call in listen-only mode. During the session, you will have the ability to type in your questions you have, and then we will read them to our presenters at the end of their presentations. I'd like to also remind you that today's meeting is being recorded and will be made available at a later date. And now to our speakers. First, we'll be hearing from the members of the Seattle OPA. Mark Gerba joined Seattle's Office of Police Accountability in December of 2018 and serves as OPA's Deputy Director of Investigations, a civilian leadership role established as part of Seattle's 2017 Police Accountability Ordinance, a role that was previously held by a Seattle Police Department captain. Dean Ike has been in law enforcement for 20 years. Currently, he is a sergeant with the Seattle Police Department and joined the OPA in March of 2020. Sergeant Ike fills one of the OPA's 9 sworn investigator positions. Chelsea Whitler joined Seattle's Office of Police Accountability in July 2020 as its second civilian investigator. Chelsea is an attorney with over 6 years of experience as a criminal defense investigator. She has worked as an investigator at both the state and federal levels, conducting capital post-conviction investigations, mitigation investigations, and fast-paced investigations for cases headed to trial. Next, we will hear from members of the DC OPC. Rochelle Howard has served as Deputy Executive Director for the District of Columbia's Office of Police Complaints since February of 2016. Rochelle's civilian government service includes serving as the Deputy Assistant Inspector General for the Inspections and Evaluations Division of the District of Columbia Office of the Inspector General. She also worked at the Department of Commerce Office of the Inspector General's Investigation Division and the Office of Personnel Management's Office of the Inspector General's Evaluation and Inspection Division. Doug Lawrence has served as a senior investigator with the District of Columbia's Office of Police Complaints for the last 19 years. In addition to his investigative responsibilities, Doug helps train the agency's new investigators, serves as the coordinator for the OPC internship program, and helps lead and develop content for the OPC's student interactive trainings and outreach program that educates youth on their rights and appropriate behavior when in contact with police. And with that, I will hand things over to Mark, Dean, and Chelsea to begin our presentations today.
Thanks, Cami. Great. So I'm Mark Gerba. I'm with the Office of Police Accountability. I want to thank Cami for the introductions as well as running the slide presentation for us. To Flo Finkel for the invite and the opportunity to attend this and to share the virtual stage with DC. I look forward to it. Our presentation is designed to give you a taste of what we've experienced in the past 4+ months based on the protests associated with the death of George Floyd. We hope that this will open up a good discussion and that we can share some of the things that we've learned over this time and hear from you. So with that, can you turn to the next slide? So this presentation by briefly covering the background of the city of Seattle and OPA. We're going to get into some of what we experienced during the protest and continue to experience. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how that's impacted us, what we did before Floyd and the Breonna Taylor protests, and then our response to the recent protests in terms of our investigations. You're going to hear from Chelsea and Dean. I've asked them to give you a perspective, boots on the ground type of perspective of investigators who came into our office. They're new. Dean started just as we were getting into COVID, and he was here and has been here throughout the protests. and Chelsea, who was interviewed and hired during COVID and jumped right in the middle of these protests. And then in the end, we'll share our unique challenges before we turn you over to Washington. Next slide.
So this slide tells about Seattle's population, which as of 2019 was 747,300 people. While the number of white, Asian, Hispanic, and multiracial city residents increased sharply during the Seattle's boom decade, the number of Black residents remained flat. From the most recent data available, the total estimated Black population of Seattle was about 51,000, basically unchanged from 2010. While the Black population stagnated, the city's total population ballooned by more than 130,000 in this period, hitting nearly 750,000 people. As a result, the percentage of Seattle's population that is Black fell to 6.8%, down by more than 1 percentage point since the start of the decade. This marks the first time since 1960 that the city of Seattle's Black population has dipped below 7%. And on to the next slide. This slide reflects the neighborhoods with a color schematic that reflects a diversity index. In looking at this slide, the darker shades of purple reflect less diverse areas. This slide also shows that many of the protests have occurred, with Capitol Hill being where the most have taken place, which is in the red square located at the right-hand on the second slide, on the second screen. Capitol Hill has for decades been a hub for movements like gay rights and other social issues, so it's not surprising that this is where many of the protests have taken place. And to the next slide. So about SPD, the city's 2020 budget reserved funding for a target of 1,422 officers. The department had 1,367 officers and recruits on the books at the end of September, with 1,203 officers actually available for service. That's fewer officers available for service than there had been at any time since at least 2010, according to the department. There was a peak of 1,350 officers in service at one point in 2018. And most recently, a Seattle Times article published on October 16th of this year noted that SPD has 110 police officers depart this year, which the numbers were provided by the Seattle Police Department. And on to the next slide.
I'm going to run through 3 key points in Seattle's history where police accountability is concerned. In 2010, the Department of Justice investigated the Seattle Police Department and found that the department was engaging in a pattern and practice of constitutional violations that were resulting in the use of excessive force, and that the department had policies and practices that were resulting in biased policing against minorities. In 2012, the department entered into a consent decree with the Department of Justice, a dissent decree being sort of a settlement. It's a legal term of art. And the dissent decree was centered around a list of reforms that dealt mostly with discipline, accountability, use of force, and community oversight. And under the dissent decree, the department would need to implement the changes and sustain those changes for 2 years. It's been a long process, and the clock on those sustained changes, the 2-year clock was not started until 2018, prior to which in 2017, an accountability ordinance was passed, the purpose of which was to enhance the level of civilianization within police oversight. SPD is still presently under the consent decree, and we recently saw the resignation of our previous monitor Merrick Bob. Bob recently stated that the use of force and crowd control weaponry against protesters in recent months had cost the department goodwill with the public and lost a lot of efforts to get out from beneath federal oversight. District Judge Robert Robart has replaced Merrick Bob with Dr. Antonio Ostale, who will be our new monitor. And if we could move to the next slide. That 2017 accountability ordinance created a three-pronged oversight system that's comprised of OPA, the Office of the Inspector General, and the Community Policing Commission. And together, these three organizations work to foster community trust in the Seattle Police Department and ensure that the department is adhering to policy and law. The Community Police Commission is sort of an on-the-ground effort to seek out the input of the communities affected by policing in Seattle to better inform practices rooted in justice and equity. The Office of the Inspector General provides objective, independent, and systemic oversight, and OPA, us, focuses on ensuring that the actions of the Seattle Police Department employees complies with law and policy by conducting thorough, objective, and timely investigations, recommending improvements to policies and training, and engaging in collaborative initiatives that promote systemic advancements. And if we could go to the next slide, please. And this chart is just a simplified version of our organizational scheme. And given that we're talking about investigations, I would just turn your attention to sort of that center column, and that's our investigations team. At the top is our director, Andrew Meyerberg, who's a civilian, and then we would drop down to Mark, who is our deputy director of civilian investigations. And on that sort of third level, we have our investigation supervisor, Grania Perkins, who is a civilian but has a very extensive policing background herself. And we have an investigations advisor, John Berry, who is an attorney. And then we have our investigators, 2 civilian investigators, myself and Dane Brewer, and 9 sworn investigators who are all sergeants with the Seattle Police Department. And if we could go to the next slide.
So this slide is the George Floyd protest, which occurred in Seattle, kind of at the very beginning, launched all the protests and along with all the complaints that came to our office. So beginning on May 29th of 2020, demonstrators took to the streets throughout the city for marches and sit-ins, often of peaceful nature, but which also devolved into riots. Then on to the next slide. So this slide shows May 30th to be the second day, and it's a part of a larger demonstration was organized and held on May 30th at the Westlake Park, joined by thousands from a protest at police headquarters, and evolved into a standoff between protesters and police, leading to acts of looting and arson all around Seattle. Protesters also blocked Interstate 5 in both directions. And on the bottom right of this slide is a police SUV, and protesters removed AR-15 rifles from this abandoned police cruiser. A security guard hired by a news crew drew his pistol on the protesters and seized back the weapons. The bottom left picture shows an incident that went viral and flooded OPA with complaints against an officer who the public believed was responsible for pepper spraying this young boy. In another incident, an officer was captured on video detaining a looter and was believed to have his knee on the individual's neck for approximately 13 seconds while bystanders urged him to stop. This continued until a second officer intervened to push the first officer's knee to the suspect's back. And that was a case I investigated. And move on to the next slide. So on June 1st, demonstrators took a cue from Hong Kong uprisings, needing SPD barricades and riot sticks with a wall of protective umbrellas. That night, a cop snatched a pink one from the front line. A scuffle ensued. SPD hits the crowd with pepper spray, flashbangs, and tear gas that spreads into apartments nearby. That umbrella became a protest icon. We'll move on to the next slide. On June 7th, during a demonstration at the East Precinct on Capitol Hill, a man drove a black Honda Civic into the crowd. As the vehicle was in motion, a protester, seen reaching in right here on this slide, into the driver's side window. The driver shot the protester, exited the vehicle, and ran past the barricade into the police line, where he was taken into custody. It ends up that the driver was a brother of an individual who works as an officer for the SPD. The gun he was carrying has an extended magazine on it. On to the next slide. And later that evening, on June 7th, police used blast balls and tear gas outside the East Precinct in Capitol Hill, even though the mayor announced a 30-day ban on the use of tear gas in response to protesters' earlier complaints. Council members called upon the mayor to resign over the way the city has handled the protests. On to the next slide. So this is showing June 7th and 8th. A blast ball hits a protester in the chest. Reportedly, protest medics and doctors bring her back to life. And a caption on this slide says, "This woman died 3 times after Seattle police hit her with a blast ball." We'll move on to the next slide. So after the protest of leading up through the June 7th, early in the afternoon on June 8th, police began moving all items of value from the East Precinct on Capitol Hill. After police withdrew from the East Precinct of Seattle, protesters rearranged barricades and declared the area Free Capitol Hill, which was then later renamed into the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, or CHAZ, and then later on being renamed in the Capitol Hill Organized Protest, or CHOP. In the coming days, the space swells with conversation, music, film screenings, co-ops, and a community garden. There are other reports of additional things taking place that are less summer love-like. On to the next slide.
As we move further into June and on into July, significant events continue to take place. The president takes to social media to give his thoughts on what's going on in the city and to tell the Seattle mayor and the governor of Washington what to do about CHOP. On June 12th, there's a silent march that's attended by over 60,000 protesters. Juneteenth rallies and protests take place across Washington. There are back-to-back shootings in CHOP on June 20th, 21st, and 23rd. Protesters, including Councilmember Kshama Sawant, lead a march to Mayor Durkin's house on the 28th of June and hold a rally there. Next slide, please. On June 28th, 2 more shootings occur inside CHOP, which ultimately leads to a decision by law enforcement to take back the area on July 1st. When that area is taken back, 44 people are arrested. Next slide, please. During the month of July, calls to defund SPD by 50% make headway. with 7 out of 9 Seattle City Council members signing on for cuts. Both the mayor and the chief of police, Carmen Vest, disagree with the plan. Protesters and their families file claims against the city, county, and state for injuries and deaths sustained during or as a result of the demonstrations. On July 25th, in response to federal law enforcement's residence in Portland and their arrival in Seattle, thousands of protesters take to the streets to express their disapproval. There is an increased amount of property damage, to include demonstrators setting fire to construction trailers at the King County Juvenile Detention Center. SPD declares a riot and deploys significant amounts of pepper spray and flashbangs on the crowd. Protesters throw projectiles and set off fireworks at officers. 45 people are arrested. Next slide, please. On August 10th, the Seattle City Council announces that it is considering defunding the SPD and that they'll do so by cutting 100 police jobs this year, scrapping a specialized unit that was responsible for, among other things, clearing out homeless encampments and cutting salaries. These cuts would equal about $3 million, a fraction of the 50% protesters are demanding. Council members promised bigger cuts in 2021. Citing the proposed SPD layoffs and friction with the City Council, who refused to allow her in on their budget discussions, Chief Best announces her decision to retire from the department. Next slide, please. And this slide is just a demonstrative to show how much has changed in the conversation around budgeting for the police department over a year. In September 2019, Mayor Durkin had unveiled a plan to recruit and retain Seattle police officers, and now here we are at the end of the summer talking about slashing police funding by 50%, with critics of that plan to defund the police saying that there's no real path forward should that funding be withdrawn from the department. And if we could move to the next slide, please. On August 16th, there was a protest held outside the headquarters of the Seattle Police Officers Guild, which is responsible for representing police officers and sergeants. SPD arrested 22 people for arson, assault, obstruction, and failure to disperse. Next slide. The protests in Seattle are ongoing. This is just a slide that shows 2 incidents that happened on the same day. On the left, you'll see the helmet of an officer who was hit with a metal baseball bat. And on the right, you'll see a photo that shows an officer walking his bike over a protester's head and helmet. And if we could go to the next slide, please.
Thanks, Chelsea and Dean. And Cami, can you go ahead and move to the next slide? So, you know, the slides that we showed just before this one, you know, deals with some of the incidents that we've experienced in Seattle, and many of those turned into complaints that we either have investigated or are currently investigating. I'll talk a little bit about how many protest investigations we currently have open in a minute. But the focus of protests before George Floyd have been primarily about social issues. It would be oftentimes rival groups, Antifa and the Proud Boys, who had either a protest that was permitted and then there was a counter protest, things along these lines. The difficulties that came, as many of you have experienced here now with George Floyd, is that the investigations that we are in the middle of now have to do with protests that are about the police. And so that presents challenges in and of itself. And so we'll talk a little bit about that as we move forward. So the next slide, please. This demonstrates, where we were prior to 2020, what's happened with our office. We received 19,000, I'll call them contacts more than there are complaints. A lot of our complaints came in, multiple complaints or multiple contacts about the same incident. So a big chunk of what you're seeing in 2020, I think onwards of about 13,000, pertain to that incident that Dean explained earlier, which was the child pepper spray case. That case has since closed, so we've closed that case and issued findings on it, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But this is what we experienced, and it was pretty overwhelming, and we'll talk a little bit more about how that impacted our office and the challenges that we faced. Next slide, please. In general, our timeline is 180 days. We have done a fantastic job of hitting that over the years. In 2019, we completed our investigations. 99% of them were completed within 180 days. Prior year was 94%. The steps that are involved here are laid out on this slide for you. We do our intake. A bulk of that intake is done in that first 30 days. So we're reviewing body-worn camera, in-car video, speaking to complainants, witnesses. Everything you would expect would go into that preliminary investigation. And then we are continuing, especially with these type of investigations, with reviews of the videos to determine whether we can understand a little bit more about what took place. Ultimately, we make classification decisions at day 30. That's where we determine whether it goes to a full investigation or is handled through some other means. And we have a variety of means that we can process a complaint through. But basically, if it's an allegation that, if true, would be a violation, we need to investigate that. Now, our investigation could be considered completed at a point of around 30 days. At that classification point, we call it an expedited investigation, where we OPA can make a finding within that time frame. Well, we won't issue the finding then, but we can complete our investigation more or less during that period after we send it over to the OIG and they agree that we have sufficient information, sufficient evidence to issue findings. But with most of these protest investigations, they have all gone to full investigation, and that means that our investigation continues with attempts to interview other complainants, witnesses, and ultimately to interview the named employees if we have them. The next slide, please. So the difference with what took place during sort of our normal course of investigations and these investigations were the intense scrutiny and interest that the public had in what was going on. So in response to that, we created a dashboard so that we could communicate with the individuals that submitted some type of complaint to us or expressed their dissatisfaction with what they observed on the internet or on TV. So if, Cami, I don't know if you can touch that, yeah, click on that and see if it'll take you to our webpage, show you an example of what this looks like. So if you scroll down, yeah, so what you're seeing here is more of what we do, the steps that we take. We detailed them out a little bit more because as we move that dial to close that donut up, we wanted to express what those percentages actually meant. So we identified 11 steps along the way. And if you scroll down a little bit more, Cami, there is a drop-down menu that gives the public a chance to look for their particular case. So there are case numbers associated with the complaints. We inform as best we can complainants about those case numbers. And then they exist here. So if you just select any one of those, Cami, it'll just show you how it'll change from what we have on that case to another one. So in this case, it's just another type of case that involves protesters being pepper sprayed. And we're letting the public know that we're about, 60% done with that case. And again, this would be based on a 180 timeline. We received a lot of positive response from the dashboard. We are up to about 130 investigations from the various protests that have taken place, and they're all on this dashboard. So we can go back to the slide, Cami. Another thing that we've done with our public affairs group is engage the community more on social media. We also explored the idea and actually implemented launching a channel that we could post a video on that would explain the director's findings. And so you'll see that as the third bullet point there. This involves the child pepper spray case. And so, Cami, if you pull up the video, this is the video that we made. It was a compilation of the different angles of the videos that are available, including the ones from the public. The director invited the media in to show this video.
Sorry about that, Mark. Are you ready for the video?
We made this available to them, and then they used it in whatever way they wanted to explain the release of the findings in this case. And we found that this is a really effective way for us to communicate and get the word out about the findings, about the work that went into the investigations. And that was one of the takeaways that we had from this. We can go to the next slide. Here, I'm going to ask both Chelsea and Dean to just share some of their experiences coming on as new investigators to our office and what they experienced.
I'll start if you don't mind, Dean. So I came on in July, sort of right in the thick of things, and I remember something Mark said over and over during the interview process, and also when I started, to the point where I was like, does he want me to take this job? But he said, this is going to be a hard job. And he explained that we're kind of caught in the middle of two opposing groups. Officers aren't always going to be very happy with us because they see us as sort of helping to facilitate witch hunts or sort of nitpicking at them and not really allowing them the latitude to do their own jobs and allow for discretion. And then the public sort of sees us as helping to protect officers who are doing harmful things to members of the community. And while it is a hard position to be in at times, what's worse throughout these protests is watching how the day after day of these two groups standing across from each other and the days moving into the nights of violence and fear and trauma on both sides. Just you can, in watching like the social media footage or the body worn video, you can see the changes in people. You can see that people are tired and that people are scared, and kind of I don't know, it disturbs me in that I don't know how we recover from this. And it's not over yet. every day we're still out there. This is still happening. And so I think that's sort of been the most challenging, more so than the job and working through the complaints, is like recognizing that we're working with humans and there's a cost to this on all sides. And it's more than just these, these administrative reprimands or being arrested. I will say I've had the chance to use some of the skills in my previous position as a defense attorney that I didn't think I would be able to use, and that's sort of this skill of meeting people where they're at. I know I have a job to do, but sometimes you just need to allow people to be. Sometimes the person making a complaint or an officer needs to be able to just direct their anger or frustration at someone over the process they found themselves involved in. Other times, they just need to be able to sit in silence with someone else in the room or have a moment to be vulnerable with someone who will keep their confidence. And I feel like allowing people to having had that experience with allowing people the freedom to express how they feel has really proven tremendously helpful for me as I navigate, coming on into this office and this space. Yeah. Dean?
Great.
My perspective since being here in March, prior to all these protests going on, March and April and up until the ending of May was relatively pretty easy at the office. And then once the protests came in, it presented a whole bunch of different challenges. So prior to protests, complainants would call with a specific allegation they wanted to make against an officer. Protests, complaints came through, and they're anonymous, very vague complaints, which kind of had the allegations of excessive force, blast balls being thrown at the crowd being OC sprayed by officers or pepper sprayed. And some of those complainants wanted to remain anonymous, while others didn't want to speak with the police. Another aspect that was challenging was reviewing the vast amount of body worn. Eventually, later on, our police chief came out and said that all protests would be recorded on body worn, which led to more body worn time had to be reviewed. Identifying officers that were wearing their helmets and gas masks, everybody kind of looking the same on the police line makes it harder to identify officers. And finally, when your investigation is about to be wrapped up, it's putting everything together, making it easy for the reader to understand and follow the chain of events. Some of the skills I employed with over 20 years of law enforcement experience is being able to navigate various departments, computer information systems, and putting everything together. Being able to identify officers who are nearby and then kind of going back and getting the body worn for those officers and trying to be able to identify everyone else standing around them. Interviewing sworn officers through this complaint, they feel that every little complaint is being considered a full investigation into them. They distrust the internal affairs process by the belief that we are out there to get them. They're very guarded in their answers, not wanting to go into detail as to what happened. And very low percentage of officers are able to articulate and provide details to the incidents that occurred. Interviewing civilian complainants through this process, their disdain and distrust of law enforcement. Definitely having a hybrid staff of investigators, both sworn and civilian, opens the option to the complainant that they're able to speak with someone who's not a sworn member of the department. And handling more and more protest cases, complainants are more likely to have legal representation rather than before they're not having someone who's an attorney or legal representation. And some are glad to see that their voice is being heard, while other complaints, and they're also glad to have their claim investigated. So, and
Great.
That is all from my perspective.
Thanks, Dean and Chelsea. And I'll add, you know, Dean brought this up and it was on an earlier slide. We are a hybrid office. We have, you know, sworn and civilians that are working together. Myself and Grania Perkins, who are supervisors, both do investigations as well. We do the individuals from lieutenant and up. So we're not just managing. We're working investigations at the same time as they are. Certainly not as heavily. The hybrid model is fantastic. I mean, I came from Chicago, and I think this model is a winning model. I think that this experience during the protests has helped to show that, because we've had individuals who have not trusted necessarily the sworn officer that they were, you know, they received a call from, and they were able to turn some of those interviews, the complainants in particular, over to those of us who are civilian. And so we were able to take that statement for them. And then, of course, having the sworn officers in the office, even though Dean talked about the distrust, I think the distrust level that officers express in the department in Seattle is different than what I experienced in Chicago, and I think a lot of that has to do with the sworn officers. They bring a lot of experience, and our perspective as civilians ask the questions of them in the middle of their investigations that they may not have thought of, and it's a wonderful combination. Again, this has stressed our system a lot, from having received 19,000 contacts plus 130 investigations with only 11 people, and we're still doing other investigations. Again, it doesn't stop with investigations of protests. We have regular IA type complaints that come into our office. So I know we're running short on time, and I'd say that those are the main takeaways. We struggled through a lot of what you are already struggling with in your situation. Looking at all of that video and trying to figure out what it is that happened, trying to find that blast ball that was thrown by the officer. Did that officer do so within policy? Was the takedown within policy? You know, what is the excessive force that was used? Why was it used? And so all of that has come into play, just as it is for you, I'm sure, in your investigation. We have a lot to share and are happy to explain more about what we do and how we tried to overcome some of the challenges that we've had. We were fortunate enough to have a former director reach out to our current director and offer some assistance. And that really, really helped out in our ability to work through the complaints that we receive from the public. They helped sort them. They helped validate those. They helped confirm that we had identified the correct complaints and that we categorized them properly. This was done by a high-tech firm that we were able to partner up with because Andrew was open to that idea, which is great because that doesn't always happen in government. So it was wonderful things came from it, and we're looking forward to some of the other learnings that we take away from this when this all finishes. We also had a major impact on our office from the social media. And I'd like, Cammie, if you'll just go to that one, we'll play the video just briefly, and then we'll end it there and turn it over to Washington. So this video shows what we had going on with the June 1st protest. The individual that you see on the screen is Amari Salisbury, and he has a fantastic presence in the social media sphere. He's well regarded. I think he's pretty balanced in his perspective. He has a daily show. I think it's daily that he puts out there. So Cami, I don't know if you can play it or not, but just play a slice of that, it'd be great. A number of things that happen from individuals or officers throwing glass balls and using pepper spray, individuals on the other side throwing things at the officers, bricks, water bottles, frozen and otherwise, back at them. So it was something that was helpful in our investigation. There was also an aerial view of that same incident. And as much as the social media was intense for us to handle because of all the complaints that we got from it, because they would direct them to us, which is fantastic. They had some trust in us. It was also something that was a benefit because we were able to use it in our investigation. And so with that, I'm sure we'll have some questions later on in the presentation, but I'll turn it over to DC, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Mark. I'm Rochelle Howard, the Deputy Director for the DC Office of Police Complaints, and ecstatic that NACOLE has given me the opportunity to sit with one of our most senior investigators, Doug Lawrence. So I'll do a little bit of an intro and then I'll turn it over to Doug so he can talk about the program that we actually have for handling demonstration and protests. I've been, as Cami said, with the Office of Police Complaints since February 2016. On January 1st, 2021, Office of Police Complaints will be in its current structure for exactly 20 years. And as Cami said, Doug's been with us for 19 of those 20 years. So it's a great opportunity. I call Doug our second legacy. We have an investigative manager who's been with us for about 2 months more than Doug. She's not here with us today. But this is actually the second time that we will be presenting on how our office handles demonstration and protests. And Doug, if you'll let me, I'm going to tell a little story that you've told me on how this happened to kind of put the context for everyone and how our 20-year model of handling, actually 16-year model of handling protests and demonstrations works for us. So in 2002, with the World Bank riots, Doug was on intake and he was getting tons and tons and tons of calls about what the police were doing in the riots. And the first executive director, we're on our second executive director, Michael Tobin, but our first executive director was Phil Ure, who is now the Inspector General for NYPD, passed Doug and was saying, why are you on the phone so much? What's going on? And Doug let him know, we're getting all these calls about police activity and police misconduct from the protests. And Phil Ure told Doug, I'll get back to you. 2 years later, Phil Ure had worked with the city, the council, the mayor, to get a statute that authorizes us to be assembly observers in all of the continual protests that we have in DC. So since 2002, we've been seeing, I guess, essentially what Seattle is seeing in the protests this summer. And since 2004, we've had statutory authority to be assembly observers, basically like the legal guild, neutral observers to monitor MPD's operations and MPD's activity with protesters who are out there exercising their First Amendment right. So Doug and I are going to talk about this like this is routine because it is. We've been doing it for 16 years. We spoke on it at the 2016 NACOLE conference in Albuquerque. And so everything that happened this summer with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor is not new for us. We, and Doug will go through the procedures that we have. We have a standard procedure that we use for activating protest monitors and staff at the agency and how we organize them and get them together. Nothing was unusual for us this summer, either when we went out for the Black Lives Matter the first week of June, we went out for the March for Life in August. We monitored the Women's March that just happened last Saturday, although we chose not to send investigators out or staff out to monitor in person. We do this all the time. As you can probably imagine, Washington, D.C. has protests every day. And since May 31st, the perimeter around the White House has been blocked off and named Black Lives Matter Plaza, and there's protests every day in that location. So it's commonplace for us, one, because we've been doing it for so long, but commonplace for us as well, because we do this no matter what, whether it's an inauguration, an uprise in police protest, or just everyday First Amendment women's rights, gender rights, LGBTQ rights. There's protests almost every day in the city, whether permitted or not permitted. So we're going to share the structure that we have and how we handle it in our office as a routine practice. So with that, I'll turn it over to our legacy, Doug Lawrence, who is the senior investigator in our office.
Thank you, Rochelle. Kami, you can go to the next slide, actually. Thank you. So what we're going to discuss today is OPC's model, OPC's authority, which is the Police Standards Act of 2004, which Rochelle just briefly discussed. We're also going to go over OPC's purpose for monitoring, Assembly Observer Operating Guidelines. That's very important because we had to establish the guidelines for how we wanted to monitor the protests, the types of protest events that we monitor, monitoring methods and techniques that we use, and also our post-event actions. Next slide, King. So OPC, we have jurisdiction over the Metropolitan Police Department. The Metropolitan Police Department has approximately 4,000 authorized sworn members. It's not quite at 4,000. Their numbers are more like 3,600, but their goal is to be at 4,000. We also have jurisdiction over the DC Housing Authority, Office of Public Safety. They have approximately 65 sworn officers, primarily to respond to the public housing areas in Washington, DC. Next slide, King. All right, so OPC, the Office of Police Complaints, we're an investigative agency with a civilian board. Our civilian PCB, Civilian Complaints Board, has 5 members currently. The new legislation is that we're expecting that to expand to 9 members a little later on this year. We have some temporary legislation that hasn't been passed to permanent legislation. We actually have the authority to investigate and resolve citizen complaints, review and report on all use of force incidents, and also recommend policy, procedure, and training improvements. And so even with our protest monitoring, what we'll discuss today and what you'll learn is we've actually written several policy recommendations as a result of our monitoring program. Next slide, King. All right, so as Rochelle discussed, the First Amendment Rights and Police Standards Act of 2004 grants OPC the legal authority to monitor MPD at protests and demonstrations. Understand that the First Amendment provides us with the right and protection to peaceably assemble, and law enforcement in Washington, D.C. is charged with ensuring public safety when people assemble in public forums. Criminal behavior at assemblies is not protected. Public safety must be balanced with constitutional rights. When you monitor protests, you're going to often hear about protests and also riots. Of course, riots can lead law enforcement to impede all people's rights to assemble and free expression. And so recently, or there's a legislation being addressed right now that involves the Riot Control Act. Rochelle, I didn't know if you did you want to expand on the Riot Control Act?
Sure. So we have a slide later where we'll outline legislation for you that the council has basically initiated. There's actually 3 acts. 2 of them were different guidelines where they're changing MPD practices and what they are and aren't allowed to do in protests and different activities. And then they also added a last minute legislation about MPD, not the Metropolitan Police Department, not being able to use chemical weapons, pepper spray, things like that. So this all spawned out of the first week, what we call the Black Lives Matter protests from May 31st. We monitored them from May 31st until June 6th. All the public publicity about defunding the police, the council jumped right in, was one of the first ones in the nation to recommend these changes. So those changes have been on the table. By the end of July, our city council had voted those temporary legislation. So they are in place for temporary legislation right now. They had a hearing, the council had a hearing last Thursday that our executive director was asked to testify to on his views of whether these changes were appropriate, efficient, and if there needs to be other modifications. That roundtable was in an effort to gain the Metropolitan Police Department, our executive director, and the public's opinions about these changes and whether they should be made permanent. We're a district, we're not a state, we're not a full municipality. All of our changes in bills that have criminal consequences to them do have to go to the Congress. So because this was emergency legislation, though, we don't have to go through Congress. And that's why the council held a roundtable last Thursday to get all of the input so they can make that decision for ourselves for this emergency legislation. So that will impact. There's a few things that we'll talk about where the council is not going to allow MPD to use chemical weapons and chemical deterrence and protests, which they have been. To talk a little bit about what happened for Black Lives Matter, May 31st in DC, there was a lot of uprising about things that the president had said over that weekend. May 31st was a Sunday, and on Friday and Saturday, he basically talked about vicious dogs being sent out to the protests. The president also erected a fence perimeter. He extended his perimeter onto DC streets. So the combination of those things and the uprising with George Floyd is what spawned the protests that we saw in the city. There was damage to the city on May 31st. There was damage to the city on May 30th. We had protest monitors out there from our office on May 31st and every other day through that week until June 6th to monitor that. June 1st, if you will remember, was the president's photo op where he closed the streets with chemical deterrents to go across the street and take a photo in front of the church that was not known or sanctioned by anyone in advance. And he actually crossed a DC street, not federal property, to do that. So there were some unique challenges. We deal with it all day and every day that there's protests. And any given time in the city, there's over 30 different federal district law enforcement agencies that have jurisdiction at the same time. So we only have jurisdiction, as Doug said, over MPD and the DC Housing Authority, but we're always working in and around. So MPD routinely works with the federal agencies to kind of gain intelligence on what and where they're going to be for MPD to know where they should be or where there's going to be groups or there's permanent activity for protests. And then we get that information as well, so we know where MPD is going to be to know where we should send our protest monitors out. So Doug will go through the procedure that we do that. But this one, honestly, was no different than any other that we do. It was more heightened. It got a lot more news coverage, but we followed the same procedure as we did. And then again, the March for Life at the end of August, we got the information we needed to know where MPD was going to be and what operations they were going to have out there for us to monitor them. We monitor MPD. We don't do anything with the protesters. We monitor MPD to make sure that the protesters can exercise their First Amendment rights. And then I want to go back to the inauguration as well. Every year, every election year, there's some kind of First Amendment assembly around the inauguration. 2017 was nothing like we had ever seen before because of the state of the country. But we did the same thing in January 2017 as we've done at every other protest and monitored it the same way. We had more people out, we had more teams, and it was longer times that we were out there. And then the next day was the Women's March, which had an insurmountable number of protesters. So even though we're dealing with heightened situations and what the media portrays as heightened situations, it is routine for us, and that's where Doug will talk through. Even the legislation that Doug mentioned that I kind of explained, it is new legislation, but it's not going to change how we operate. If anything, it just gives us a different set of rules to hold the Metropolitan Police Department accountable to. Thanks, Doug.
Thank you, Rochelle. Next slide, King. Thank you. Okay, so we use the word assembly observers because it implies neutrality. We keep an eye out for incidents of police misconduct. We try to make sure that MPD adheres to the policies, rules, and training according to their standard operating procedures for their civil disturbance unit. It also makes sure that our agency demonstrates a commitment to ensuring fair and unbiased policing. We act to de-escalate tensions between citizens and officers. We deter unconstitutional behavior and police misconduct before it occurs. There are times where people will see OPC on the scene and you'll see the protesters actually change the direction of where they were going to go, or you'll hear them say OPC's here. Let's deal with this later, you know, because we have, and you'll see what we wear when we monitor, but it actually, we feel that it actually deters behavior. And recently, as Rochelle mentioned, the relationship between protesters and officers has intensified. The power to protest often used to challenge police-related incidents and demand effective reform. And so as assembly observers, because it implies neutrality, people have come to us and they've actually said, we're glad you're out here. We do see legal observers on the scene as well. However, although legal observers may also represent that neutrality, traditionally, legal observers are a part of the legal community. So people may ask us, well, OPC? Okay, I'm familiar with OPC. And if they're not familiar with OPC, they'll ask us, OPC, you're out here, who are you watching today? And we'll say, we're monitoring the police. We want to make sure that you're allowed to have your right to assemble peacefully. And they'll say, oh, okay, thank you. Thank you for being here. And that's the approach we take. So we're not out there hiding. We're not out there trying to disguise who we are. I find it very effective that we have the assembly observer armbands and hats that we wear, and also jackets. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. Okay. All right, so the important thing is, and what was one of the challenges, was establishing our guidelines for how we wanted to do things, because we wanted it to be consistent. So as an organization, for every, and this is for every event that we're going to monitor, and we never deter from these procedures and guidelines, we'll have a team coordinator or someone coordinate the monitoring event. So for instance, it's normally either myself, or it could be Rochelle, or it could be our legal counsel, Alicia Yaz. One of us will begin to coordinate the process of monitoring an event based on the information that we receive from the media or through our sources. We want to know if there's going to be a protest. Are they expecting to have counter protesters? What are we hearing about the event? How many people are expected to be in attendance? Once we gather that information along with the purpose of the event, we'll then determine how many teams we're going to need to go out there. And that's going to depend on the event and the size of the event. So then each coordinator or team coordinator for that particular protest will prepare a briefing memo. And within that briefing memo, it's going to address the size, the mobility, the purpose, and the length of the protest. That's very important, because these are primarily, this is very effective when you have a planned event. And we'll also talk about an unplanned event, because there's two types of protests. There's a planned event or an unplanned event. So we're going to go over each type of protest that we monitor. So for planned events, the briefing memo will have an idea of the size, we'll have an idea of the mobility, meaning, is it going to be more of a rally at a central location, or are they going to actually march or snake march through the streets? That's very important, because then that may change the number of zones that we're going to have to monitor. It also, in reference to our equipment, people often wonder, what type of equipment do we use? We use the same investigative equipment that we have access to during our normal investigations: our iPads, tablets, cell phones, cameras, and maps. Also, we address the ethics issue, the fact that we need to be neutral out there, meaning we're not going to appear, we're not going to say the chants and wear T-shirts and signs agreeing or being favorable maybe to the people that are coordinating the protests or the event. We're also going to familiarize ourselves with MPD's standard operating procedures, or SOP, MPD's general policies for dealing with all demonstrations, rallies, and marches. This will include going to some of their courses on crowd dynamics and getting an understanding of how their civil disturbance unit is going to respond in certain situations. So during as we're preparing for the presidential inauguration, MPD's CDU unit normally provides the training for all law enforcement that comes in town for that event. And we also participate in that training. And so that's been very helpful because we actually learn what MPD, what their goals are, what they're trying to accomplish. Normally they're trying to allow people to assemble peacefully. We'll also learn how to prepare the debriefing and record the overall summary of the experience. And we'll get into that in a little bit. Next slide. So again, our observers will act in an objective, professional, and neutral manner. That's very important. We're not going to take sides. We're not going to wear the clothing, hats, or armbands, distinguishing ourselves as being the observers. We're not going to wear any clothing with political slogans or offensive language. That's very important.
So Doug, if I can jump in there.
Sure.
One other question that we never had before, but we've been getting this year, I think, as more and more oversight entities are getting involved in figuring out how to participate in protest monitoring. One question that keeps coming up is, because we're out there as protest monitors, we may witness certain things. Our goal is to be out there to witness certain things, to see what MPD's interactions with the public is. And some people have wondered if that's a conflict. And so I'll try to answer that to my best ability, although I don't understand the question, because we are administrative investigators. It's not a criminal process. We don't have criminal authority. And so because we are administrative investigative agency, our investigators are administrative investigators, there's no criminality to it that would create the same legal ethics that would apply to, for example, say prosecutors who had witnessed something and then they couldn't participate in it. Secondly, even when we don't witness anything, or even if we do witness police misconduct, we can't initiate complaints. Our statute says that we can't even initiate a complaint for someone who did not have firsthand knowledge of the incident. So anyone who's viewed social media or watched police misconduct on the TV, that's not allowed for our complaints. It has to be someone who has firsthand knowledge. So we don't initiate our own complaints, even though we've noticed the misconduct, even though we have firsthand knowledge. What would happen is, and we've had in the inauguration protest monitoring, we actually had investigators that were pepper sprayed and hit with the propel bullets from those guns, so the pepper ball bullets. So they draft every time, as debriefing, like Doug talked about, we always draft up a statement of what we saw for our records. We do that for multiple reasons. We do that because if we have the firsthand knowledge, that information would get added to a complainant's complaint that it's signed saying that they saw, and be additional evidence that we can add to that investigation. Of course, the investigator who did the statement would not be the investigator that receives and investigates the complaint. The other part of that is a lot of our statements, our debriefing statements, our videos, our photos that we take just in our regular monitoring process that we do for ourselves to notate what we've seen, can have two different benefits to other entities. In the inauguration, and then we collect that evidence to see if there's policy recommendations we need to make to the Metropolitan Police Department. And so with the inauguration, we saw a lot of mishandling, as Doug mentioned, from the MPD CDU unit. And because we had attended the training, we knew what the requirements were supposed to be. And MPD CDU did not even follow what they had trained us all on and what they were supposed to do in the inauguration protests when they had protesters causing damage. So because of that firsthand knowledge and the firsthand knowledge of MPD's training just 2 weeks prior, we were able to collect information and make policy recommendations to the city about how MPD's policies were not being followed. They didn't even follow for themselves. What the city did with those statements and that information is they hired an independent contractor based on our recommendation to do so, hired an independent contractor to have then the neutral look on everything that we had collected and everything that we had said was a violation. That independent contractor did a separate report. They were able to review more evidence than we would have ever been able to do with our 20 people, hours and thousands of hours of body worn camera footage along with our statements. And that helped the city and MPD change their policies for them to be able to follow them in the future. So when the Black Lives Matter protests happened, in June, we actually saw some of the mishandled protest practices by MPD that were done in January not happening in this opportunity because of that work and those recommendations. Just quickly, the other part that comes up is sometimes, for example, now, this happens all the time, it's not unique to just these situations, but since it's on everyone's forefront, the Black Lives Matter protest the first week of June, we had a lot of evidence. We really did not see much misconduct that happened. We got a lot of calls, we got thousands and thousands of what we call contacts, but only about 10 to 12 investigations were initiated out of that. But we had tons of evidence from being out there most of the week. Because MPD is now sued, along with the president, for the actions in the Bible photo opportunity, the Office Attorney General of the city has asked us to retain and hold that evidence in case they need it in that litigation. So even us being out there doesn't create a conflict in all those different ways, and it actually has been beneficial because of the neutrality in the office. So I just wanted to address, thank you for the opportunity, Doug, address the ethics question that has been coming up offline about how we handle that. So hopefully that helps people understand how there's a multitude of benefits if you handle this neutrally, as we think we do, for the city, for the department, and for the community.
Thank you, Rochelle. Next slide, King. Yeah, and so people often ask, is there coordination with law enforcement? And the answer is, we're familiar with, for most of the planned events, we're familiar with who the incident commander is going to be. We're going to identify where the command post is. We may try to look at or obtain access or gather information as it relates to the event, the permit holder, and the organizers. Because again, we're going to want to know approximately how many people they're anticipating, where it's going to be. For us, it's very important to know, is it going to be a rally at a central location, or is it going to become a march through the streets? And that's very important as we plan to prepare for each event. So what happened is, we have a public affairs specialist at our office. So our public affairs specialist, Nikisha Cleveland, she will actually put out the information that we're going to monitor the event. And she will actually, during each event, we have a Facebook page, we have social media that we actually put out information to the public that we're monitoring the event. And so if someone contacts, or someone may contact our public affairs specialist during or after the event, to my knowledge, people don't really contact us ahead of time to ask if we're going to be monitoring, because for the most part, they're familiar with, it's likely that we will be out there. If the mayor's going to send out an all hands on deck notification to MPD, then there's a strong likelihood that we're going to also monitor the event. Next slide, King. And so Rochelle talked about some of the new legislation that has passed. Rochelle, did you want to get into this part here, some of the new legislation with the identification requirements of MPD during First Amendment assemblies, and also the limitation on use of banned chemical weapons?
Sure. So quick, I'll get into a little bit more specifics, and then this is the legislation that we were talking about that just had the public roundtable and input from MPD and our executive director last Thursday. I imagine a vote will come from the council to make it permanent, because the only objections that the city received, the city council received from it at that roundtable on Thursday was from the Metropolitan Police Department. There's a few things that they said they thought would restrict them in their operations, although overly they're not fighting it, because again, that would affect the community trust that they have from the city. So a little bit of specifics. So the first one is basically what the city is calling the police reform bill. It actually has about 10 changes. It's everything that's out in the media under the defund the police. There's one misnomer though. If you look at the DC budget, or if you hear anyone talk about the DC budget, It looks as if the council has taken $15 million away from the Metropolitan Police Department, but they haven't. They were going to give MPD $15 million extra this year, and they've taken that back to align it with other priorities in our neighborhood safety engagement, into the violence disruptor programs that the city initiated in 2016 with a new crime bill that they put out then. And so there's a few specifics that might be of interest to people that actually have come out this that are going to have monumental changes. For one, as Doug mentioned, our police complaints board is 5 members. They're volunteers from the community. They have to be from different wards. Not all of them, they all have to be district residents, but they all have separate jobs outside the city, outside of the government. And so one of those members is a Metropolitan Police Board member and has always been a Metropolitan Police Board member in our current existence since the 20 years that we've been in existence. This police crime bill, as we're calling it, police reform bill, actually takes away that police member and will add 4 more civilians, or 5 more civilians, to make 9 civilians that are volunteers on our police complaints board. Now, let's be clear, our police complaints board signs off and has to approve every dismissal. So these are active, even though they're volunteers, they're active participants in our operations. They monitor the director's work of the operations of the city. And so that's huge to have 5 more that will have input and be available to support our operations, minus the Metropolitan Police Department member. One thing, as I mentioned before, we cannot initiate a complaint unless we have a signed signature, whether it's electronic signature now or physical signature, on a complaint form from a first-hand witness. And we cannot initiate our own complaints. What has happened over the years is that we will see, for example, Doug may be looking at a case and body-worn camera footage, and he'll see other misconduct by other officers. But because the complainant doesn't have 5 body-worn camera views, they don't see all the misconduct. So in the past, whenever we do that, we alert it to MPD, tell them we've noticed this potentially other violation, but we've never had the authority to add that other misconduct, even if when it wasn't brought up by the complainant, to our case. And so this police reform bill will allow us to do that. That was one of the recommendations we asked for, so that we can address all misconduct seen when there's a complaint about an incident. And then we see other misconduct. We actually have the physical evidence from the video of that misconduct. So one other thing, as Doug mentioned, most of the police reform changes are coming from our policy recommendations over the years. So we will draft a policy recommendation when we start seeing trends in our investigations. And so these are some of the things over the years that we've seen trends of when we've done policy recommendations to the city or the Metropolitan Police Department for them to change their practices and or allow us to address. And so that happened in 2016. For example, body-worn camera footage, we initiated in 2014 with a recommendation. The district got it in 2015. But one other thing that we've been talking about is the Metropolitan Police Department doesn't necessarily get let me say it this way, how they're handling consent searches isn't the best way it could be. It's not the most effective practices, and it creates a lot of confusion with the community. And so we had a recommendation where we asked and drafted a form for MPD to use to make it clear that they have consent from a community member before they do a consent search. So the council also included that recommendation, that policy recommendation, in this police form bill. So those are just a few specifics about how that's going to change. And just for clarity and kind of perspective, these are the types of things that cities are calling defund the police. It's really not defunding them. It's really, at least in the district, addressing the procedural highlights that an agency like us has brought to their attention. And so the last one is what I mentioned earlier, where it clearly says there that it's going to prohibit the Metropolitan Police Department from using non-lethal chemical projectile types of weapons and activity to disperse crowds when there is no specific violence against or harm against a police officer. So those are 2 of the bills that went. There's another one that's tertiary. But if this helps anyone, if you have more questions about this legislation and how we're handling it, because it is going to change our operations for the better, please reach out to us and we can talk more specifically. I can send you the statutes, the drafts of the bill before they go into law. So thank you, Doug, for that.
Thank you. Next slide, Kate. So monitoring methods and techniques. So again, we mentioned providing a briefing memo to the team prior to the protest. Within the briefing memo, you want to have the anticipated size, mobility, etc. We're going to obtain general information regarding the protest and demonstration. We're also going to create a map and establish zones and time frames for the event. And you'll see that in the next slide, or one of the next slides, you'll see one of those where we actually have the zones and teams created. But also it's very important that we have our contact information for all team members. And that's very important to include that information on the briefing memo. Next slide, King. All right, so again, the briefing memo is definitely going to have the when and the where, meaning where the location of the, and again, this is mostly for planned events, and we'll get into unplanned events, but what that helps us do, if we know the when and the where, it helps us create the zones and the teams. And that's very important because for every event, we want to have a rally point in case something happens. You don't want your team to be out there and not have a rally point in case something happens. We also make sure that each team member has the necessary equipment that they need, and then also things to pay attention to or to note during the protest. And that's very important. Like we mentioned earlier, all of our investigators during their orientation go through the protest monitoring training. So this is nothing new. It's just a matter of asking deciding which investigators or which teams are going to monitor the event. We already know what we're supposed to do when we're out there. It's just a matter of determining who's going to be where. Next slide, King. All right, so here's the briefing map from the most recent protest that we monitored. Actually, it was the March on Washington, Get Your Knee Off My Neck march this past summer, and it was held at the Lincoln Memorial. So for this particular protest, where you can see the Lincoln Memorial with the star, there was a stage set up. And that's very important because for planned protests, most planned protests will have a stage. Now, what you have as a coordinator, what you have to determine is whether or not you think it's necessary for your team to be at or around the stage. And that's an investigative decision that the team leaders make, again, depending on crowd dynamics, because I don't encourage the investigators to get caught within in an area where it would be difficult for them to maneuver out of if something happened. However, some events where there's a stage, if something's going to happen, that may be a likely place where it's going to happen. So a lot of times for every event or for most protests, either myself or Alicia or Mike or one of the investigators will do a drive-through to look at the area, to look at where the event is, the planned event, where it's going to be. And we'll try to look at where the potential zones or good locations for the zones. In this particular case, the stage was in front of the Lincoln Memorial. And then the second part, they marched from the Lincoln Memorial to the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial. And so what we did was we had two zones. We had a zone on the north side of the Lincoln Memorial, and we had a second zone on the south side of the Lincoln Memorial, near the MLK Memorial. And so we had the primary areas covered, and then we had and that was there was a time for the event. So the event was from, say, 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. So that would be our first two teams would monitor during that time frame. However, after the summer of George Floyd protests, we began to notice that the protests would take place later in the evenings. And so that created a challenge for us because we had to sort of modify how we do things. We didn't modify how we do things, but we had to modify when we do things. So instead of having a monitoring team from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m., we would have a second group monitoring team come in for the evening shift. And the evening shift might be, say, from 5 to maybe 10 o'clock at night. And so
Doug, we're running out of time.
Yes.
If you'll jump 2 slides.
Okay.
We have some other information there about the types of protests. In the slides after this, we have some information about a little bit more about the methods and techniques, but I want to end on the pictures. A slide back, Cami. So if you see here in the bottom middle, you'll see the jackets say OPC, and then you see that highlighter small yellow armband. That's it's highlighter yellow. It says OPC Assembly Observers. That's the gear that we generally wear. We have hats as well to identify ourselves as Assembly Observers. I know we're running out of time. We did have a couple more slides, but please email us. Doug or I can send you the slides so you can have all of the written information of how we do this. With that, Cami, I'll turn it over to see how you want to handle questions.
Thank you, and I'm so sorry that we cut that off because all of the information that's been presented today has been phenomenal. We have all of our speakers have graciously agreed to stick with us for a little bit so we could answer some of these questions, even though we're pushing against our 90-minute mark. So thank you for agreeing to do that. And just to follow up on what Rochelle just said, we will actually send copies of these slide decks to all registrants, probably in the next 24 to 36 hours. So please be on the lookout for that. And if you don't receive it, just let me know and I will make sure that you do. So with that, we do have a lot of procedural questions about how you actually do these in your agency. The first one is for those of you from OPA. Are Seattle Police Department officers required to display their badge numbers on their helmets, as is the case in many other police departments? And if not, is it being considered as a change in policy?
Dean, you want to take that?
So on their riot helmets, officers are not required to display their badge numbers on top of there. I'm not sure of any policy that's being talked about with the command staff at this time.
And I know I can comment a little bit about that. I know the OIG is doing a sentinel review as well on all the protests, and so they may be addressing it. We have a public affairs unit that is and has addressed things that Rochelle was speaking about earlier, which is the less lethal chemicals and other weapons. And so our focus wasn't on that, but we do and have done that, and we do have other partner agencies that are working on those things as well in terms of recommendations.
So, oh, and Cami, just to add, name tags are required on the back of the helmets, but not badge numbers.
Okay, thank you for that addition. Thanks. The next question is any best practices or lessons learned on engaging social media before, during, or after demonstrations and protests?
Who was that for, Kim? Seattle?
Well, I think it was originally written during Seattle's presentation, but it'd be interesting if both of you have something to add to that. But if you want to start, Mark.
Sure. So we had a lot of experience with social media, and I think what we're realizing is that it's something that we needed to capture early on and save. And so we're exploring adding a video unit to our group or a cadre of investigators that are well trained in that, so that we don't lose it. So some of the links are broken, and so you might lose a valuable video that's sent to you. So those are some of the lessons that we learned as we went along. And again, some of the investigators are just not necessarily familiar with it. So again, you also need tools, special tools that you can pull them off of the internet, that type of thing. So I think we've learned a lot in the process. We have some software that helps in that, and hope to build on that.
Great, thank you, Mark. Rochelle, Doug, do you have anything to add to that?
Doug, I'll leave it to you.
Yeah, no, our public affairs specialist handles a lot of the social media type questions or any information that comes. And again, she normally provides that information during the actual protest as well.
One of our regular programs is outreach. So we have outreach activities, as you talked about in the beginning, Cami, the student interactive trainings. We do those throughout the year to engage the community on how they should interact with the Metropolitan Police Department and how they can use our services. So that's ongoing the entire time. And then before, after, during a protest, like Doug said, our public affairs specialists will use our Twitter page, our LinkedIn page, our Facebook page to let people know we're out there. We all post as well. You know, I've tagged NACOLE in some of our protests as I've been out there with the teams to let everybody know what we're doing and how we're doing it. So that's how we use it.
And just to add, Cami, you know, we're also learning that there's a lot of AI capabilities out there where some of these videos can be altered and they can do a really good job at it. So one of the things that I haven't necessarily talked to the director about, but we need to do, is that we need to consider what we can do to understand whether that video has been manipulated. And so one of our partners in the process has been Microsoft, and I know that they're at the forefront of some of this. So, but even then, some of their technology is reportedly only picking up like 80% of it. So if it's really good technology, you can get 20% that are going to get by the best.
So I'm guessing that what we're all saying here is that there's lots of lessons learned and many more to come through this process. Oh, the next question is, please explain how the hybrid investigations in Seattle, civilian and sworn officer investigations work. Is it a joint investigation for each case? If not, how is it decided which cases are investigated by whom?
So I'll just pick up with how we decide, but I want both Chelsea and Dean just to explain briefly about what their experience has been. And so I do a lot of assignments of the intake so that ultimately become investigations, or Grania Perkins will do that. And when we do that, we don't pick who gets a particular investigation based on whether they're civilian or sworn. By and large, the only restriction we currently have is that if a potential policy violation that we're viewing in that particular case may be trending toward a discipline that could involve termination, then we have some restrictions as it pertains to our civilian investigators. When we run into that, we then partner our civilian up with a sworn, and the sworn leads according to the contract. So Chelsea and Dean, maybe you can comment about what your experience has been working individually or with the team.
I'll say, even though you are assigned, there is an assigned investigator that might be a sworn or a civilian, we're a very collaborative office, and we check in and tap people for their experiences, interests, and expertise. I know that coming into the office, I knew next to nothing about policing. I had an idea of some things coming from a criminal defense background, but as far as like the day-to-day and investigating like a police officer would, that was a lot of what I had to learn. So I was constantly tapping my sergeant colleagues to sort of help me develop that perspective. So while we are assigned to our own cases, there's a lot of room for collaboration, and you're never without the help that you might need at any given time.
Yeah, I think the hybrid method works very well. I thought it wouldn't be that great in the beginning. Have civilians trying to figure out police work, especially when it comes to administrative issues. But so far, it's actually worked really well. Get along with civilian investigators, along with the civilian supervisors as well. Everybody, especially in this office, works very well together. It's enjoyable. I really like it. I know some of the feedback from officers on the street is when they have a civilian investigator come to interview them, it seems kind of awkward at first because they don't take orders, kind of quotations from a civilian. It's more of a supervisor position. So that was kind of interesting in the first few interviews that I've sat in. But other than that, it's a great place, great mix of having a sworn and civilian investigators.
Thank you. Thank you for those answers. The next question we have is for Rochelle and Doug. With the assembly observers, so the 5 civilian members of the OPC are also the assembly observers, or do they recruit other people to serve in this role?
So I'll take this one, Doug, if that's okay. We have 5 civilian members of the Police Complaints Board. There are 23 members of the Office of Police Complaints. We are all civilians. The 23 members of the actual staff of the office are government employees. The 5 Police Complaints Board is just who we report to, because we don't report to the mayor. We are independent. Therefore, we don't report to the mayor. The mayor gives us a board to report to. So I think there might be some confusion there. But the 23 staff that we have in the office, and if we have interns, we allow them to go too. We don't necessarily allow others to come with us because we have the statutory authority. And so for the first time that I think any of us have ever remembered, with the Black Lives Matter protests the first week of June, the city council wanted to jump in with us and go out there. And the issue during that week was there was a curfew. So unless you had a legal authority or you were a protester violating the 7 p.m. curfew, you had no legal authority to be out on the street. And so we had council members spontaneously decide to show up at our office to join us in protest monitoring under our statutory authority as assembly observers, which is very unique for us. The executive director decided to do it, but we had very specific, they don't have the training, they don't know how to handle it. You know, we could be in the middle of a kettling incident with Metropolitan Police Department, and we know what to do for those of us that have been trained and those of us that have done it before. So it was actually very cautious for us. We were very skeptical, you know, about the actual added burden that it put on us to have people who had not done this before use their government authority to be out there with us. But we handled it fine. It went fine. You know, we tried to limit their access to violence as best as we could and predict it. But so I think hopefully that clears up. We normally just do it with the staff, the Police Complaints Board, because they are our bosses. Those volunteers, they have come out with us before because they have the authority to do so under the statute. But it is mainly the 23 staff that we have at the Office of Police Complaints that are government employees that we train and involve in the organization with.
And I just wanted to emphasize safety. Safety is always our #1 priority. It's the main bullet on every briefing memo. We try to make sure that we monitor, but in a safe way. And that's very important to remember, because a lot of our investigators, are they concerned when they go out there? Sure, certainly. COVID has created additional issues because there was some concern. If we monitor, are we becoming a part of a super spreader type situation? So we had to address all those issues this summer, and it was very challenging, but we were able to manage.
Thank you, Doug and Rochelle. So next question, we'll try to get to a couple more here. Do you have any specialized either one of you have any specialized software that allows you to synchronize multiple videos from body-worn cameras and videos taken by members of the public?
So I'm going to jump in there because I think there's a confusion of semantics. So, Cammie, you mentioned body-worn camera footages from the public?
Body-worn camera and videos taken by members of the public, and if you're able to synchronize those.
And so I don't necessarily know what synchronize means, but I'll tell you how we handle both of those, and then Doug can talk about the mechanics briefly if I missed something. So we have direct access to evidence.com. That is the website, internet-based website, where all the BWC is downloaded from the Metropolitan Police Department. Our investigators have their own evidence.com accounts where they can go in and have been given certain roles and authority to do so for investigative purposes. So we have direct access to BWC. We also get whatever evidence the community has about their complaints. Beginning in 2016, we had our online complaint form. So someone can, while they're in the middle of a protest, go to our website, go to our online complaint form, fill it out, and attach any videos, photos, whatever the recordings that they have to it. And so we get that evidence that way too. I will go further to say, if there is a way that we synchronize it, it's in our case management system, which is iPro. It's a commonly known the police department case management system that we got in 2009 and have been using since. So that's now all of our cases are electronic. We don't have paper on any of our cases anymore. So we synthesize all of the evidence that we get, whether it be the body-worn camera footage or the evidence, the video media evidence that the complainant has, into each case in our case management system.
Mark, Dean, or Chelsea, does your office use any kind of software like that?
Yeah, we do. We use Input 8 and AMP5, and so we have that capability in-house. We're still developing it though, and it's super important, right? You need to try to figure out how you can link up, for example, in that video that we had of the child pepper spray, linking that video up with the various body worns. And I suppose if there were other in-cars would have been very valuable to give you more of a 360 view. And I think that's what the question is about. So we do have it. We also have a very good relationship with SPD's video unit. So if we get down to a situation where we need that, we would turn to them. We've also gone to outside experts to do some video work for us as well. So we've spent the money where it's necessary in an important case. But ultimately, our goal is to build that in-house so that we can do exactly what they're asking about.
Thank you. So a question for Seattle. Of the 19,000 complaints, how many were dismissed as unsubstantiated so far, or percentage? I know we talked a little bit about this offline.
Yeah, I'd love to say that we have a hard number. We don't. I mean, I think look, we had 19,000 plus contacts. It goes along with what Rochelle is talking about. We consider them to be contacts as well. The difference is that we could take an outside individual who complains about an incident that they see on Facebook Live, and the individual who actually filmed it, for example, Amari Salisbury, doesn't have to be the person that comes to us to complain about whatever activity it is that they think violated policy. So there haven't been a lot that we have, if you will, determined were unsubstantiated. And the reason why we have 130 investigations is because many of the complaints that we got pertain to incidents where it's plausible that there was a policy violation. So we're investigating, and it's also plausible that it was lawful and proper, or that it was unfounded. So we'll go through the steps of the investigation on that, as opposed to, closing it out as what we call a contact log.
Thank you. I think with that, we will have to unfortunately end today, but there were a couple more questions. I'll forward those on to the speakers so that we can get some answers on those as well. So with that, again, thank you, Rochelle, Doug, Dean, Chelsea, Mark, for taking the time today to be with us. We have heard from a lot of people about the need for additional policies and support when it comes to the handling of demonstrations and protests, and I believe the information that all of you gave today will be of incredible help to the oversight community and beyond. I'd also like to thank all of our attendees today who joined us and who hung in there as we decided to stretch our time a little bit today. Our community is better because of the commitment that all of you are showing to training and effective practices. So thank you to everyone for being here today. The 2020 NACOLE webinar series is not over. We will be having additional sessions in November. The next one is on November 5th. Please watch your inbox and the NACOLE website for details as they become available. And with that, thank you again, and I look forward to being with you at our next event. Thank you, everyone.